Episode number 159 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. I'm Michelle, a fertility acupuncturist here to provide you with resources on how to create a wholesome approach to your fertility journey. My guest today is a woman named Melissa Harris. Melissa was told by doctors that she may never have another child. After 9 surgeries, years of fertility treatments, and a heartbreaking miscarriage of twins, she brought micro-preemie Sam into this world. His fight for survival alongside his persevering mothers is a subject of inspiration in Melissa's new memoir, 1 pound, 12 ounces, a non-medical, non-religious look at premature birth and miscarriage. Welcome to the podcast, Melissa.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
So you have quite a long and traumatic but miraculous journey. Can you share your story?
Sure. So I always like to start with the end, which is I have 2 wonderful children, 16 and 11. Getting to them was very different. So with my 16-year-old, my now ex-husband and I were like, let's have a baby. And a month later we were pregnant, and it was a boring pregnancy. We evicted her. Like, she didn't want to come out. She was really happy in there. About 42 and a half weeks in, my doctor finally said, we gotta, it's time. Pretty uneventful birth story. I ended up having a C-section because despite pushing for 3.5 hours, she wasn't budging, but she was healthy. She was great. I mean, it was, a pretty simple, classic, I want a baby. Look, I have a baby. For the second one, things took an interesting turn. I've learned now terms like secondary infertility, which I didn't know was a thing. But when it came time to having my second, my husband and I were like, okay, it's time, let's do this. And it took a little while to get pregnant, and we were kind of wondering what was happening. But about 4 months in, found myself pregnant. But when I went in for the 8-week ultrasound, there was no heartbeat. And so
it's horrible. That's the worst.
It's horrible. I've now discovered it's not quite the worst, for me at least, but it was gut-wrenching. And I had to have a DNC, and it was just a really kind of traumatic, I'd never thought it would happen to me moment. But it did sort of firm my resolve in wanting another child. And so we started trying again once my body had healed. And I think we tried for like 7 or 8 months and had no luck. And so my regular doctor put us on Clomid, which is one of the pills that's supposed to help with your fertility. And there, in rare cases, some people have a side effect where it thins out your uterine lining. Mm-hmm. I was one of those, but we didn't realize that for 4 months on Clomid. So I was taking this pill that's supposed to make me really, really fertile. And I probably was, except there was nowhere for an egg to implant because I had no lining. Mm-hmm. And she finally transferred me over to a fertility specialist who sat me, we both went through tests. So for my husband, that test is a real simple one. He gets to go and look at a dirty magazine and play with a cup. And I undergo test after test after test. They like to do an HSG. I can never say what it is. I always try to, but I fail. But to sort of just check out my anatomy and see what's going on. And after all the tests were done, the doctor sat us down and looked at my husband and said, "You're fine." And looked at me and said, "Well, you're a reproductive nightmare." And I was like, wow.
Oh, really? He said that to you?
He did. And he said, "I also would say if I didn't know you had a child, I'd tell you that you would never be able to have a child naturally." And I was like, well, I can bring her in if you want to meet her. I mean, she looks just like me.
Wow. That's crazy.
And he said, "Okay, let's outline what's wrong with you." Fantastic. Let's do that. Because, feels really good. I didn't ovulate every cycle. I had a retrograde uterus. So it was tilted in such a way that for sperm to get where they needed to go, it was an uphill battle. My cervix didn't fully close. So even if they got where they needed to go, the cervix closing is what keeps them there. And most troubling, I had almost a complete bicornuate uterus. So meaning there was a septum in my uterus, dividing it into almost two distinct chambers.
Right.
And, it kind of made sense. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I always joked that I felt like she was trapped on one side, that I was lopsided with her.
Oh, wow.
And it turns out I was lopsided with her. So I had one chamber that was big enough to carry and one chamber that was not. And so the risk was, if I got pregnant, the egg, not only, first I had to get pregnant, then everything else had to work. And the egg had to implant in the chamber that was big enough, because it implanted on the septum or in the smaller chamber, I would miscarry.
Right.
So after he gives me this prognosis of being a nightmare, he says, now let's talk about how we're going to fix it. And I was very excited that he had a plan. The main part of it was to have a hysteroscopy, which is like a pap smear, but a little deeper and with an aid of twilight anesthesia. And normally you go in, you have this, they remove the septum, and you've got a beautiful chamber. Unfortunately, my body is really special, and it took 9 of those surgeries. Every time he would go in, I would either be bleeding and he couldn't see, he found a polyp, I was bleeding again. I mean, it was a nightmare. And in there, I guess it was about the 7th one, he felt he had gotten enough. And we decided with letrozole, which is a different one, fertility pill. It's supposed to help stimulate just one egg to drop, because he was very concerned about me getting pregnant with multiples. So with letrozole and the IUI, or the turkey baster, or the intrauterine insemination would be the nicer way to put it.
Yeah.
I got pregnant, and I went in for my 8-week ultrasound, and he's looking around. He's like, oh, there's the heartbeat, and look at how strong it is. And then he moves the wand and he goes, and there's the heartbeat, and look at how strong it is. And I was like, oh, hey, now wait, say that again. And even though I was only on letrozole, apparently my body dropped 2 eggs. Then I was pregnant with twins. Fast forward about 2-3 weeks, I went back for another ultrasound, and the heartbeat on one of the twins was quite weak. And the doctor said, I don't believe that twin is going to make it. Which he viewed as a good thing, because he really didn't think I could carry twins to term. And he gave me the choice. You could do selective DNC, where they would try to remove the twin that wasn't healthy, or wait, and usually your body reabsorbs the fetus.
Wow.
So being such high risk, I chose to wait. I wasn't going to risk anything.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be going okay. He had me coming in weekly for ultrasounds. I came back the next week. There was no heartbeat on the second fetus, but he said everything was looking really good. The other baby was really strong. And I got to the point where once I crossed 12 weeks, you're discharged from your fertility specialist and over to your OB. And usually it's like a 2 or 3 week before you go into your OB, and you meet your OB and do all those things. And in there, things took a turn. So while I was at work, I felt what felt like bleeding. And I was in the middle of a big meeting, and I said, I'll be back in a minute. And I got up from my chair and started walking to the bathroom. And I felt, I best describe as like a water balloon explode in my pants, basically. And it was blood and clots.
Oh my God.
Which I know because I left a trail into the bathroom.
Oh my God.
And
poor thing.
It was awful. I had to be taken out by ambulance to a local hospital, where The technician did a quick ultrasound, and the baby was fine. It turned out my body decided to expel the other twin. There was a third option, apparently neither of us had considered. But I was put on bed rest from that point on. And so went home and spent that day kind of just resting. The next day I was okay. The day after that, I woke up and I felt contractions. And I called my OB, who I hadn't met yet. I explained my situation, and they just were not, I don't think that they got the urgency, and they were very nonchalant about it and said, if you have an appointment in 3 days, if you're that concerned, go to the hospital. So I went to the hospital because the contractions just kept getting worse and worse. And, you sit in those awful emergency room chairs, and then they took me back for an ultrasound and things looked okay. So they put me into a room. I think they were going to try to see if if just being hydrated and resting would help. And I got up to go to the bathroom, and while I was on the toilet, basically I miscarried the other twin.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry to hear this.
It was horrible. I mean, horrible. I'm traumatized to the day because I could see the twin hanging out of me. I mean,
God.
Yeah. That miscarriage took a very long time to mentally, emotionally, and physically recover from. But I'm stubborn, and I really wanted a second. And so we went back to the doctor and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do one more IUI, and either it's going to work or it's not. But I couldn't keep going through the process. And so with letrozole and everything, went through it. I got pregnant. And this time at, I think, 8 weeks, my fertility doctor and a high risk OB met, discussed my case, had a handoff where I was discharged from fertility, and I had an appointment an hour later at the OB's waiting. And so I was under a very watchful eye. If I even had like a drop of blood, I was on bed rest for 3 days. They treated me as the high risk that I was. And I was lucky. I mean, that pregnancy was pretty easy up until when it wasn't. I was not on bed rest that often. And I was 23 weeks and 2 days pregnant when I happened to be at my parents' house, and I went to the bathroom and I noticed there was a decent amount of blood. And I called my OB. She said, I'll meet you at the hospital. I want you in labor and delivery. Go now. And I got there, and apparently I was dilated to 7 centimeters, and I was contracting every 2 minutes.
Wow. Oh my God.
And they immediately put me in Trendelenburg, which is you tilt the head of the bed down. So your head is like 30 degrees below your feet, basically to use gravity to keep everything where it is supposed to be. And then hooked me up to magnesium sulfate, which is to stop the contractions. And then they added another drug, and I laid like that for 6 days.
Wow.
Desperate to make it to that 24-week mark, which back then was viability.
Yeah.
And gave birth to my son at 24 weeks and 2 days. So he was 1 pound, 12 ounces at birth, and spent 95 days with him in the neonatal intensive care unit. He had heart surgery, eye surgery, and 8,000 other tests and interventions along the way. And got to bring him home about 3 weeks before his due date. And he is now an 11-year-old comedian who makes me smile often.
Well, that's the miracle part of the story.
Yes.
And it just gives me chills. What a beautiful, I mean, to know that he's okay. Thank God.
Yes. That's why I always like when people ask my story, I always like to start with, I have 2 children.
Yes.
because, there is a happy ending with this one, which I know is not the case for all, but at least in mine,
Yeah.
there's a lot of trauma, but there's a lot of happy at the
Yes.
end.
Yes, absolutely. And it is, when you had said I'm stubborn, it's something that actually comes up a lot is that I feel like when you have that calling to have kids, that's like a thing. It's a real
Yep.
thing. It's not just random. There's a reason how it's going to turn out that we cannot control. You don't know how it's going to pan out, but I really do believe that calling is real.
Yeah. I mean, in the grand scheme, I probably should have given up because,
Hmm.
I suffered the multiple miscarriages. Going through the process to get pregnant was, when you're suffering from fertility and you desperately want a child, every month is a loss when that stick
Yeah.
doesn't turn positive. And it is grinding. It grinds you down because especially when you go through the testing and you know that your partner is fine, it's your fault.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
failed. And it's a horrible feeling. You're constantly feeling like a failure and disappointment and sadness. And you have a few days to mourn, and then you get right back on the horse of measuring fertility and plotting and timing. And it is a real grind.
Hmm.
And I was in that grind for about 2.5 years. And, meant for my mental health, I probably should have stopped, but I couldn't. I wanted 2 kids.
Yeah. But somewhere you knew that it was possible,
It was. And,
even though you were faced with the impossible.
the other part that made it so hard is my daughter. I'd sit and I'd look at my daughter, who's this beautiful, vivacious, caring, fun to be around kid. I'm like, I want another one of those because she's
Yeah.
awesome. And so that was also driving me a lot. Is I knew how great one kid was, so I was convinced the second would be as great as the first.
Yeah. Although I do kind of want to make a note here. Obviously, your situation was great. In cases where it's life threatening, those are the things, and you really do need to be surrounded by doctors like you were. There's certain cases that you really don't want to mess around, and thank God it turned out okay for you.
Yes.
But it is really important that nobody puts themselves at risk, you
Absolutely.
know.
And also,
Yeah.
self advocacy became a really, I mean, when I look back on the learnings I had going into the final pregnancy, I wasn't messing around. And I insisted that the fertility doctor and the OB had a handoff and that there was no
Yes.
break in care. And that,
Hmm.
if I had pushed for that the first time, would it have been different with the twin pregnancy? I don't know. But
Yeah.
knowing what you need and fighting for it is one of the lessons that I got through this, is that if you believe that this is vital, don't settle for anything other than what it is you feel you need.
Yeah, because it's true. People are not going to give you what you need a lot of times. They're just going to give you the standard.
Mm-hmm.
And you internally, everybody has an intuition. It's a survival instinct.
Yep.
You know, you knew that you needed it in the first high risk pregnancy. You felt it then, but but they didn't catch up with you. They weren't on the same level.
Right. And I wasn't confident enough to push. Whereas in the
Yeah.
second pregnancy, I mean, there was no, I had the confidence to push. Like I knew it had to happen. Um,
Yeah.
and the other thing that I really, really learned through all this is, as I was saying, it's a grind, and it'll weigh you. Is I was surprised that as I started to talk about my story, how many other people I would encounter that were in similar situations. And I'll
Hmm.
never understand why infertility and miscarriage is suffered in privacy and quiet and away from people. There's this societal pressure to keep it to yourself.
Hmm.
And I have learned
Absolutely.
that that's a mistake. Like
Oh, it's
It's
harmful.
extremely harmful. The support of community and friends and family and camaraderie in those that you had no idea went through it is what gets
Hmm.
you through a lot of this. And so having the strength to talk to others about what you're dealing with is really important for helping you get through it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we store it in, the trauma we store in our bodies. It's really getting through and allowing yourself to process those emotions and dealing with it and talking about it in a safe place. You have to be in a safe space because otherwise it's more harmful
Yep.
if you're in a place that's not supportive, which is something that's very important to mention because there are family members and there's some well-meaning ones that love you, but they won't necessarily understand the same way that a community or people that really understand the process will.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it definitely is very important to lean and take the support of a community for sure.
Absolutely.
And I know that you work with a congresswoman, right?
So
Or that
in
you've reached out.
Yeah, in about 2017, when the Republican majority was trying to overturn the Affordable Care Act, my congresswoman, who I'm very lucky to be represented by Barbara Lee, who I adore
Hmm.
in general,
Hmm.
asked for people to share stories of what the ACA has meant for them. And I
Hmm.
shared my story. I have insurance because of the ACA. I'm a freelancer, so I don't have insurance
Hmm.
through work. And had I not had that and the protections, especially for pre existing conditions,
Hmm.
I mean, my son is a walking pre existing condition. So
Yeah.
I feel very strongly that healthcare is um, a right in this country and everyone should have access to it.
Yeah.
And she took my story and had me come in and sort of tell my story on video and shared our story on the floor of the House of Representatives as part of her efforts to protect the ACA. And it's something that I will speak up for whenever anyone asks me to.
Yeah. And also, I wanted to know how your son is doing or how he was doing and how, if it affected him, how,
Sure. So his
yeah.
prematurity, at first, his biggest issue was his gastrointestinal tract was slow. So he had a
Hmm.
lot of poop issues, is a nice way to put it.
Hmm.
And he's grown out of most of those.
Hmm.
He is slightly nearsighted. So when he was in the NICU, he had surgery to save his eyesight.
Hmm.
One of my great trivias that I love is Stevie Wonder is blind because he was premature and he
Hmm.
suffered from retinopathy of prematurity where the retinas detach. And my son had, it's called ROP, he had it and had a doctor came in and did laser surgery on his eyes and saved his sight.
Hmm.
And Sam is autistic, which
Hmm.
to me makes perfect sense because when he was born, his brain was one smooth organ. There was no left right division, there were no ridges, there was nothing. And so all
Hmm.
those connections were formed in an unnatural environment of an incubator.
Hmm.
But again, he's bilingual.
Hmm.
He's mainstreamed at a bilingual school. He loves F1 racing and NASCAR, which I do not understand, but I'm going with. He's a voracious reader and rips through books faster than I can buy them.
Amazing.
He's hysterical. He loves to tell jokes. He's loving. I mean, he's a great, happy, vivacious 11-year-old. And
That's amazing.
he has no lung issues. If you lined him up and said, pick out the one that was under 1,000 grams at birth, trust me, he's not who you're pulling out of the lineup. He's big.
Hmm.
I mean, yeah, he's incredible.
Wow, amazing. It is so amazing. And I know that you've really suffered PTSD and how I know that community has helped you. Like, how are you doing today and how has this, I mean, I know it's been affecting you, but how are you able to cope with it really?
Um, so I know what now I can recognize the triggers. So hospital soap. There's a particular soap that they used in the hospitals that has that. It's a smell, and I smell that, and it will immediately trigger me. Which I
Yeah.
discovered when my mom had to have bypass surgery.
Mm.
Um, the other way is I don't hold it in. I talk. I'm
Yeah.
very open. I write. Part of what really saved me in all of this was writing. I wrote every day about whatever I was seeing and experiencing. So I never held it in,
Mm-hmm.
which, releasing it, while it doesn't make it go away, it gives it at least the space to breathe and not fester.
Yeah.
I went to therapy because,
Mm-hmm.
you can't do it on your own. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
but really, for me, it's recognizing what my triggers are and knowing that if I have to be in an environment where I might have experienced one of my triggers, is to make sure someone is with me and be prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you're talking about the smell of the soap because the same area of the brain that has that sense of smell, it's very close to the memories. And sense of smell immediately brings you back to a memory
Yeah.
of when you first smelled that smell.
Yeah. And, in the NICU, I joke having a preemie prepared me for COVID more than anything in the world, because going into the
Yeah,
NICU, you had to wash your hands for 1 minute, and you'd sit there, and
right.
you had to get in the fingernail beds. And if you
Yeah.
left the room that your baby was in to go to the bathroom or to talk to someone outside the room, you had to wash your hands before going back in. And
Hmm.
so I was an expert hand washer before
Yeah.
COVID. And then when I brought him home from the hospital, it was during flu and RSV season. And because
Hmm.
how small he was, we were not allowed out in public from December
Hmm.
21st until May 1st. So we were
Hmm.
in the house.
Yeah.
Again, totally
So you
prepared.
quarantined before COVID.
Exactly. So, I mean, I felt like COVID came down and everyone's like, oh, how are we going to do this? I was like, please, I got this.
I'm an expert. I got this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it is interesting. The hospital soap is the main one. The other one is more in the hospital setting, but it's the sound of machinery in the hospital. So the beeping of a heart and
Hmm.
oxygen monitor.
Yeah.
There are times where I hear that still in my sleep, or if I'm just sort of zoning out, I can sometimes hear the beeping sound happening because it was the sound of the NICU.
Yeah. Oh, it's so crazy. It really is, those things don't leave you when you have trauma. It's just a matter of learning how to manage it
Mm-hmm.
in life.
Yeah. And so I just try to avoid hospital soap. Like if I know I'm going to have to go to a hospital setting, I literally pack a little bit of soap with me so I can
Yeah,
use
that's
my own
smart.
soap.
That's actually really smart.
And it's what I've learned on how to try to avoid the trigger.
Yeah, totally. And I know that you've written a book about
I
this.
have.
Yeah.
So when I was going through it in the NICU in particular, I craved information. I wanted that community to tell me what was going to happen. And what I
Yeah.
found out there were books by medical professionals who also had a preemie. So they were very medically
Hmm.
focused, or ones that really focused on this is God's will and go with it kind of approach, which
Hmm.
is for
Yeah.
me. And there was nothing out there that I could read that made me go, okay, this is going to suck, and there's going to be good and there's going to be bad, but
Hmm.
you might get through it. And so I wanted to provide that for others. So I wrote a memoir. Funny enough, it's called 1 pound, 12 ounces, which was my son's weight at birth. And it chronicles my struggle with fertility, my miscarriages, my time in the NICU, and then takes us up to my son's first birthday. And I don't sugarcoat. So it's very honest, it's very raw. There are moments that are awful in it.
Hmm.
And then there are moments that are, you kind of feel what the slog of the NICU is, because it is a slog.
Hmm.
Um, but my hope is that this book can provide for either people that are faced with premature birth or know someone going through it or are related to someone, just a window into what it's like.
Yeah.
And to know that, again, it tries to push the idea of don't keep it to yourself, talk.
Yeah.
um, and it's going to be really hard, and there's going to be days that you don't think you're going to get through it, and there are going to be days where you think it's never going to end. And while it doesn't always end as positively as my experience, it can.
Yeah. Knowing that there's that possibility, I think really so important that you mention is self advocacy. I think that's huge because it's a game changer.
It really is. And there's one of the experiences in the book was a nurse. um, I named her evil nurse. I never even learned her name. She was so
Hmm.
awful to me and to my dad. And the worst was she treated, on one of the few visits that my daughter was willing to come to the NICU, she was 5 at the time, she was mean to
Hmm.
my daughter.
Wow.
And
Unreal.
I lost it on the nurse manager. And I was like, if I ever see her near my son again, I will transfer him to another hospital. I was like, no, just
Yeah.
no. And
Yeah.
other than that, I mean, I had wonderful nurses and doctors, but that one nurse was just awful. And,
Hmm.
I really learned to push for if I was going to be
Yeah.
there, and I wanted people who I liked, because my view is if they like,
It's the
yeah,
energy, the vibe that they give off. The baby feels it, everybody feels it.
exactly. And like his main nurse, I talk to still. I mean, it's 11 years later,
Yeah.
and she's Auntie Laura, because I mean,
Mm,
every single
that's
day for
nice.
95 days, I would sit with her for 5 or 6 hours a day. I mean,
Wow, that's
she
amazing.
was my guide and I mean, she was great. She would tell me, be look at me, be like, you're being rude, go home. It's like, okay. I mean, it was, I mean, I was really lucky.
Yeah, amazing. It's so crazy how the story kind of shifts and turns, and there's so much to learn from it, but yet, there was this beautiful, amazing miracle in the end, which is, it's great, to hear. And I think that you telling the story also gives hope because there's so many times throughout your story that it was utterly hopeless.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, when a doctor tells you you're a reproductive nightmare,
Yeah.
it's that moment where you're like, well, there's no hope. There's nothing we can do. What what's the point? And to have him then lay out a plan
Hmm.
for how we're going to overcome what's we can overcome, and
Yeah.
really work with you was great. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, a lot of what comes out in the story is it's not just the self advocacy, but it's also finding the right doctors and the
Hmm.
right nurses, because good
Yep.
good
100%.
medical
You need a good
care.
team.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm lucky. I live in the Bay Area, so I have access to excellent medical care, excellent
Yeah.
hospitals, and and if I don't like one of the people I'm working with, I can find another one who's excellent.
Yeah.
But
Amazing.
making
Yeah.
sure that you have a good medical team behind you is really helpful.
Absolutely. So for people who would love to read your memoir and really dive deep, how can they find it?
So it comes out November 2nd. It's available
Hmm.
at all the usuals of like the Amazon and the bookshop. They can also go to my website, melissaharrisauthor.com, and there are links on places to buy there. And then there's some pictures of Sam, some of
Hmm.
the from the NICU, and there's at least one from today to be like, don't forget he's big now.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it'll be out November 2nd.
Wonderful. Melissa, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it takes a lot of courage for anybody who's really sharing their story. And obviously, it's so raw. And I love the fact that you're honest with it because I think that people really respect it. And they also get comfort knowing the
Yeah.
realness of a person's story and then really relating to it.
I figure if I'm going to
Yeah,
tell it, I'm not one to move around things. Like the uncomfortable parts are important for understanding.
they are. They are. It's so true. The comfortable parts are important. It's important not just, for people to really get it and feel it and connect with it. And I think you're very brave for sharing your story. I really do think so.
Well,
Not a
thank
lot of
you.
people do that. And it's hard.
It is, but it's also part of my healing is telling my story.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on today and I thank you so much. And it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. It was great talking with you too.
So that concludes today's episode. You can find all of the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to share and leave a review. Reviews mean everything to podcasters, and I really enjoy hearing from my listeners. You can also find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com or email me at info@thewholesomelotus.com. I love hearing from my listeners. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com. I thank you so much for listening in and hope that you have a beautiful day.